Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. Our town was one of those quiet places where nothing much ever changed. We had one main street, a diner that closed at 7, and an old steel water tower that leaned a little too far to one side. At the edge of town stood a tall metal siren tower, built sometime in the 1950s, back when people were worried about air raids or tornadoes. Every Saturday at noon without fail, it wailed for exactly 1 minute. It was part of the town's routine, the kind of thing everyone just tuned out after living here long enough. You'd hear it and know the weekend had officially started. I used to hear it from my back porch every Saturday when I'd be out mowing the yard or washing the truck. The sound would echo through the valley, bouncing off the hills before fading out. It was oddly comforting in a way, proof that things were still working, that someone somewhere still remembered to keep the old traditions going. Then one weekend, it didn't go off. At first, nobody cared. Most people thought it was just a small technical problem, or maybe the timer burned out. By Monday, though, everyone had heard that Dale, the town mechanic, hadn't come into work. His shop sat right next to the post office, and he was one of those guys who never missed a day unless something was seriously wrong. His wife, Marlene, told people that he'd gone to check on the siren that Saturday morning, because it hadn't gone off at noon. Apparently, he had the only spare key to the maintenance shed at the base of the siren tower. He never came home. The police searched for days. They checked the nearby woods, the creek that ran behind the old grain elevator, even the drainage ditches along the highway. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a tool, not even a footprint leading away. When they finally broke the padlock on the maintenance shed to look inside, the only thing they found was Dale's jacket neatly folded on the concrete floor. On the workbench beside it lay the manual crank that could start the siren by hand. It was turned halfway. After that, nobody really talked about the siren anymore. The sheriff ordered the shed sealed up again, and for a while, everyone just avoided that side of town. The tower stood there like an empty skeleton, its metal rusting and the paint flaking away. You could see it from almost anywhere. The diner parking lot, the high school field, even my front yard if you looked between the trees. Weeks turned into months, and Dale's disappearance just became another strange story people whispered about when they ran out of other things to gossip over. Marlene moved away to stay with her sister in Nebraska. The police filed it as missing under unexplained circumstances. The siren never went off again, but I kept thinking about it. I'd known Dale most of my life. He fixed my car more times than I could count. He wasn't the kind of man to just vanish. He wasn't careless either. He'd never leave his jacket folded like that unless he planned to come back for it. Something about it didn't sit right. Sometimes at night I'd walk my dog past the hill where the siren tower stood. The dirt road leading to it was overgrown, and the chain across the gate had a new lock on it. You could barely make out the shed in the moonlight. A small square building with peeling green paint and a metal door. It always gave me a strange feeling, like I was being watched from somewhere higher up, even though the tower itself was silent and lifeless. About 2 months after Dale went missing, I woke up around 3 in the morning to what I thought was wind. My window was open, and the air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that makes every sound seem sharper. But then I heard it again, a low mechanical whine, faint and rising like gears turning slowly. I sat up, listening. It came in short bursts, spaced out, as if someone were trying to start something by hand. It sounded like the siren winding up. It never went full blast, just that rising hum that cuts off before it builds into the real thing. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, maybe some kind of farm equipment out on the highway, but it kept happening every few nights, always around the same time. The noise was never loud enough to wake the neighbors, just loud enough to reach me if the wind was right. Curiosity got the better of me. One night I drove out toward the tower. It was a clear night, No moon, just stars scattered across the sky and the faint orange glow from town behind me. The gravel road crunched under my tires, and when I cut the engine, the silence felt heavier than usual. My flashlight beam bounced across the grass as I walked up the hill. The tower rose above me like a black skeleton against the sky. The shed was still locked. Same rusted padlock, same dented door. I stood there for a while, waiting. The air smelled faintly of metal and rain, even though it hadn't rained in days. My heart was pounding for no good reason. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, a voice, anything. But there was nothing except crickets and the distant hum of the highway. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard that sound again. The low whine of the crank turning. It came from right behind the shed, short and jerky, like someone testing it. I froze. My flashlight flickered, and when I pointed it toward the sound, there was no one there. Just the grass moving in the breeze. The sound stopped as soon as the light hit the shed. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to convince myself it was just the wind moving something loose inside. Eventually, I got back in my truck and left. By the time I reached my house, the noise had stopped. After that night, I started hearing it more often. Always faint, always around 3 a.m. Sometimes it lasted only a few seconds, sometimes longer. It never reached the full siren pitch, like it was caught between starting and stopping. Nobody else in town ever mentioned it, and I didn't bring it up. I figured people would think I was imagining things like everyone else who can't let something go. Then, early in November, I went by the tower again during daylight. The gate was still chained, but there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt leading up to it. Someone had been there recently. I walked around the fence looking at the ground. There were boot prints too, deep ones like whoever it was had stood there for a while. I followed them a few feet, but they stopped halfway up the hill and didn't turn back. Just ended, like the person had vanished mid-step. I didn't go back after that. Winter came, and the nights got longer. Every few weeks I'd still wake up to that faint sound, the slow winding of the crank. It would stop after a few seconds, leaving the air too quiet again. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if someone was trying to get the siren going again, or if maybe it was just the old mechanism seizing up from rust. But deep down, I knew what bothered me most wasn't the sound itself. It was that it only ever happened at the same exact time Dale went missing. This spring, the new town council decided to finally decommission the old tower. They said it was unsafe, that it might collapse in a storm. They sent a crew out to take it down piece by piece. I went out there the day they started just to see it go. The workers cut through the bolts, lowering the siren head carefully with a crane. When they pried open the maintenance shed, dust poured out like smoke. Inside, everything was just as the police had left it. Dale's jacket still sat folded on the floor. The crank was still in the same position, but one of the workers noticed something else. Behind the crank in the concrete wall was a thin vertical crack about shoulder height. When they pulled at it, part of the wall shifted. It turned out there was a narrow service crawl space built behind the shed, probably used decades ago to access the wiring. When they shined a light inside, they found an old metal ladder leading down about 10 feet into a small chamber filled with debris. At the bottom was a toolbox, a flashlight and a single boot, mud-caked, with the initials DM scratched into the heel. They never found anything else. Now the siren's gone. The tower's gone, and the hill is just another empty patch of grass. But some nights, especially when the wind's coming from that direction, I still wake up around 3 a.m. The air feels heavier then, like the whole town is holding its breath. And sometimes, if it's quiet enough, I swear I can still hear that slow mechanical groan, like something deep underground turning halfway, then stopping. I moved to Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 2015, when I got a construction job outside town. It was one of those jobs where you work long days, come home covered in dust, eat whatever you can find, and crash before the TV even shuts off. I didn't know anyone in town, so I just needed a cheap place to stay. The landlord showed me a tiny one-bedroom house right behind the old fire station, white paint flaking off, a small porch leaning a little to one side, a narrow driveway filled with gravel and weeds. He told me the rent was low because the siren from the fire station could get loud sometimes, especially at night. I didn't care. The price was good, and I liked that it was tucked away from the main road. The house was small but comfortable enough. A single front room that served as both living room and kitchen, one small bedroom, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of old pipes no matter how much I cleaned. The back door opened onto a short wooden step that led into a patch of uneven grass, bordered by a rusted chain-link fence. Beyond that was a small slope that dropped into the fire station's back lot, where they used to park trucks decades ago, before the newer building was built on the other side of town. The old one was abandoned except for some storage and the siren, which still went off for volunteer alerts. The first few weeks were fine. The siren wasn't as bad as I expected. It would blare maybe once or twice a week, echoing off the nearby buildings. But I'd already be half awake from habit. The nights were quiet otherwise. Too quiet sometimes. That part of town didn't get much traffic. I could stand on my porch at midnight and not hear a single car. Just the occasional hum of power lines or the rattle of a train passing miles away. It started with the latch. The back door had this old metal latch that rattled if the wind hit it just right. The first night I noticed it, I assumed that's what it was. I remember waking up around 2 in the morning, half asleep, hearing this soft metallic clink. It was faint and rhythmic, like someone lightly tapping or jiggling the handle. I got up, walked to the kitchen, and looked out the window above the sink. The porch light was off and everything outside looked normal. I went back to bed thinking it was just the wind or maybe the house settling. But then it happened again the next night. Same time, around 2 a.m. The latch, the handle, that faint metal-on-metal sound. I got up again, stood in the dark kitchen listening. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but something about the pattern bothered me. It wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was testing it. I locked both the handle and the deadbolt tighter and went back to bed. The next morning, I checked the door. Nothing unusual. I even shook it myself to see how it might sound. It didn't match exactly. I told myself maybe the wood was expanding or something stupid like that. Still, I started leaving the porch light on at night. That didn't help. Over the next week, it kept happening. Not every night, but enough that I started dreading 2 a.m. I'd wake up on my own around that time, even if it was quiet. The latch noise was always soft at first, barely audible, then would stop, then start again. I'd sit up in bed listening to my heartbeat and trying to convince myself not to check. But curiosity always got me. One night I stayed up intentionally. I turned off all the lights, even unplugged the little clock radio that glowed by my bed, and sat in the kitchen in the dark. I wanted to catch whatever it was, animal, wind, or something else. I sat there with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the back door. The moonlight came through the curtain gaps, faint and silvery, just enough to see the outline of the door handle. At 2:17 a.m. I heard it. The faint clink just once, then again. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. The handle turned slowly and I froze. It creaked as it twisted. Then the door gave a small, strained sound like wood shifting, and opened just enough for the chain and deadbolt to hold it. About an inch of space, maybe less. Through that small gap, I saw a pale reflection, then realized it was an eye. Just one, wide open, staring straight in through the gap. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just watched. I don't know how long I stood there. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stared back, heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then, as slow as it had opened, the door eased shut. The handle released. Silence. I waited another 10 minutes before I could move again. I walked to the door and flicked on the porch light, expecting to see someone running away, but there was nothing. The yard was empty. The chain-link fence hadn't moved. The grass was still. I checked the door. It was still locked tight, but the wood around the latch had new marks. Thin scratches, uneven, like someone had been working at it with a knife or something sharp. The next morning in daylight, I looked closer. The paint around the latch was chipped in a circle, deep gouges in the wood, some old and faded, others fresh and pale. It wasn't just from the night before. Someone had been trying for a while. I called the landlord that afternoon. He didn't seem surprised. He just said, "Yeah, that's been happening since the fire chief died back there." I didn't even know how to respond to that. I asked if anyone else had lived there after, and he just said most people didn't stay long. That night, I pushed a chair under the door handle and wedged a broom against it for good measure. I barely slept. Every sound made me jolt awake. The siren from the fire station went off once around 10 p.m., and for a second, the red light from the tower flashed through the kitchen window, painting the room in pulses of color. It reminded me of the eye I'd seen through the door. I tried to stay another week, but it got worse. Even if I didn't hear the latch, I started noticing things out of place. My back porch light would be unscrewed when I came home, just enough that it wouldn't turn on. Once I found fresh mud prints on the wooden step, bare feet, wide and short, like someone had stood there barefoot facing the door. They weren't mine. I didn't even go barefoot inside. I started parking my truck closer to the front, under the street lamp, even though it meant a longer walk up the path. Every night when I'd come home from work, I'd scan the yard and the lot behind the fire station. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the outline of that old building and its empty windows. The last night I stayed there, I woke up again around 2. Not from the latch this time, just from a feeling like my body knew something was wrong. I sat up and saw faint light flickering through the back window, like someone was walking past it with a flashlight. I turned off the fan to listen. The floor creaked once in the kitchen. That was enough for me. I didn't even check. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and left. I sat in my truck with the headlights pointed at the back door. Nothing moved, but I could see the door's outline shifting slightly in the wind. I didn't stay to see if it opened. I drove straight to a motel off Route 322 and called the landlord in the morning to say I was done. He didn't argue. He just said to leave the key in the mailbox. A few days later, when I came back for the last of my things, I saw the door again in daylight. More scratches. The edge of the deadbolt had been chipped, like someone had pried at it with a screwdriver or knife. The marks were fresh, shiny metal exposed under the paint. I stood there for a while staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Maybe some local creep knew about the place being empty before, and didn't realize someone had moved in. Maybe it was some squatter trying to get back in. Maybe the landlord didn't tell me the full story. Whatever it was, I didn't care anymore. I drove away that day and never looked back at that house behind the fire station. Sometimes I still wake up around 2 in the morning, half expecting to hear that latch again, that slow, deliberate sound. I moved state since then, but every place I rent now, the first thing I check isn't the price or location. It's the back door, the latch, and how solid the deadbolt feels when I lock it. I worked the overnight shift at a small 24-hour gas station just off Highway 3, a few miles south of St. Marie's, Idaho. The locals called it the loneliest stretch in Benua County, and they weren't wrong. It was mostly truckers, hunters, and the occasional lost tourist who stopped by after midnight. The place sat on a bend between thick pine woods and an empty 2-lane road that stretched on for miles, with no other lights except ours. The only sound most nights was the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing above the pumps, and the occasional thump from the ice machine outside. The store itself was old, built in the late 70s. It had that smell of old oil, rubber, and floor cleaner that never really went away, no matter how much you mopped. The counter had a scuffed laminate top, and the security monitor was one of those small black and white screens split into 4 camera views. My boss made us keep a logbook by the register, a big spiral notebook, to record license plates and vehicle descriptions of anyone who stopped during the night. It wasn't for fun. We'd had a couple of gas-and-go incidents, and there were stories about people sleeping in their cars out by the tree line. The county sheriff's office sometimes reviewed the pages when something weird happened along that highway, so we were told to be specific. Time, plate, vehicle color, direction of travel. Most nights were slow. Sometimes I'd go an entire hour without a single customer. I'd drink bad coffee, check the pumps through the window, and flip through the pages of that logbook when I got bored. It was routine. I'd even memorize the sound of every little thing. The click of the door chime, the dull drone of the air conditioner, the crackle of the intercom when someone picked up a pump handle. The quiet made you notice things you wouldn't normally notice. One night around 2 in the morning, I was leaning on the counter, flipping through the logbook. I wasn't looking for anything, just killing time. The entries were mostly neat, dated with plate numbers. Red Ford F-150, white Toyota Corolla, that kind of thing. But when I got to a page from a few weeks back, early August I think, I noticed something that didn't fit. The handwriting changed near the bottom, and one line stood out from the rest. The time read 2:39 a.m. Under vehicle description, someone had written, "None, man on foot," kept circling. Beneath it, in darker ink and a messier hand, another note had been added, "Don't let him inside." I stared at it for a long time. It didn't look like a joke. The first line was in Karen's handwriting. She used to work the shift before me until she quit a couple of months ago. The second note didn't match hers. It looked rushed, like someone wrote it fast, maybe nervous. There was no follow-up, no explanation on the next page. Just the next day's entries normal again. I turned a few more pages, but there wasn't anything else about it. At first, I laughed a little under my breath, thinking maybe they were messing around. Karen was jumpy, the kind of person who thought every noise in the dark was something. Still, that second line, "Don't let him inside," didn't sit right. It wasn't written like a prank. It looked like someone meant it. I tried to forget about it, went back to restocking the drink cooler and wiping down the coffee counter. But I couldn't stop glancing out the window. The parking lot was empty, the lights buzzing like always. The woods across the highway were a black wall, and the wind barely moved the branches. Around 3 a.m., when the air gets heavy and everything feels quieter than usual, the motion sensor chime went off. It startled me, that soft ding from the door sensors. I looked up immediately. No one was at the door. The camera monitor didn't show any car pulling in either. I leaned forward, scanning the screen. Then I saw movement on camera 3, the one facing pump 4. There was a man standing there. He wasn't moving, just standing by the pump, staring straight up at the lights like he was confused by them. His clothes looked dark, maybe a heavy jacket or coat. His hair was long, maybe down to his neck. I couldn't tell his age or his face clearly on the grainy black and white feed. He had that look people get when they've been outside too long, like they're not fully there. His posture was stiff, hands at his sides. I remember how still he was. Not even a shift of weight, not a scratch, not a glance toward the store. I went to the window and looked out, but I didn't see him at first. Then my eyes adjusted to the glare of the canopy lights, and there he was, right where the camera showed him under pump 4. The weirdest thing was how bright he looked under the lights. His face was pale, eyes turned up, blinking slowly like someone watching falling snow for the first time. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just there. For a moment I thought about going out, asking if he needed help. But that line in the logbook popped into my head, "Don't let him inside." I hesitated. Maybe he was just some drifter. Maybe he was on something. I decided to stay put. I reached for the phone to call the sheriff's non-emergency line. But when I looked up again, he was gone. Just gone. I didn't see him walk away. No car, no movement toward the trees, nothing. The lot was empty again, all 4 pumps standing in that cold white light. I waited a few minutes, staring at the cameras, hoping maybe he'd show up on another feed. Nothing. I even stepped outside to look around. The night air was sharp and cold, and the only sound was the buzzing of the lights and the soft hum of the highway far off. The pavement was dry, no footprints, no sign of anyone walking off toward the woods. I felt my stomach twist a little, not from fear exactly, but from confusion. Didn't make sense. I went back inside, locked the door just in case, and sat behind the counter watching the monitor until sunrise. No one else came that night. When the morning shift showed up, I told myself not to say anything. I didn't want to sound crazy, especially since I didn't have proof. I checked the logbook again before leaving, and that same page was still there. Same writing, same lines. But the next night when I came in for my shift, the logbook was gone. I asked my boss, trying to sound casual, if he'd moved it. He said he hadn't, that it should still be by the register. We both looked, even checked under the counter, the office drawer, the shelf by the cigarettes. Nothing. He told me to grab a new notebook and start a fresh one. He didn't seem to think much of it, but I did. I'd looked through that book almost every night for months. It had pages dating back a year. It didn't just disappear. For a while after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there again. Sometimes when I stepped outside to empty the trash or clean the windshield squeegees, I'd get that crawling feeling between my shoulder blades like someone was watching. I'd glance at the pumps at the edge of the woods, half expecting to see a shape standing there. Once, about a week later, I thought I saw a shadow move near pump 4 on the camera. But when I looked up through the window, there was nothing. The feed flickered for a second and then cleared. A month later, I heard from the morning guy that someone had found an old campsite off the highway, maybe a quarter-mile from the station. It looked abandoned for a long time. Ripped tent, empty cans, and a torn jacket. He said the sheriff's office had gone out to check, but no one knew whose it was. They said it looked like someone had just walked off and never come back. After that, the night started to feel different. The air outside always seemed colder than it should be, and I stopped checking the cameras as much. I kept the door locked between customers. Every time the chime went off, even when it was just a trucker coming in for coffee, I felt my chest tighten until I saw a face. I still don't know who that man was. Maybe he was real, maybe he wasn't, but I know what I saw on that camera. A man standing under the lights, staring up like he'd never seen them before. The page in that logbook wasn't a joke. Someone had seen him before me, written the warning down, maybe for themselves, maybe for whoever came next. And when I think about how that book disappeared the very next day, I get the feeling it wasn't misplaced at all. Someone took it, someone who didn't want anyone reading that page again. It was May of 2003, the night of our senior prom in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Everything felt like it was supposed to. Warm air, the smell of lilacs, and that strange in-between mood where we all knew high school was ending, but none of us really believed it yet. After prom, a few of us decided to drive out to Lake Wissota. It was a tradition in a way. Someone always ended up there after big nights. Homecoming, graduation parties, whatever. There's this old access road on the south side of the lake that no one uses anymore. It's half gravel, half mud, and ends near a little clearing where you can park right next to the water. You can't see it from the main road, and the few houses nearby are far enough away that you can play music, and nobody bothers you. There were 7 of us total, all around 17, all drunk off cheap beer and the kind of nervous excitement that comes from pretending we were adults. We had 2 trucks parked nose to nose to make a little circle of light, the tailgates down, a cooler in between, and music playing from one of those portable stereos that still took CDs. The air was still, not much wind, and you could hear everything on the lake, the occasional slap of water on the shore, a loon calling somewhere out in the dark, and the distant hum of a highway miles away. It was quiet enough that our voices felt too loud at times, like we were disturbing something that had been sleeping there long before we showed up, sometime around midnight. I remember sitting on the tailgate staring out over the lake. The water was so flat it looked like black glass. That's when I saw the lights, 2 small, steady points of white far across the water. At first I thought it was a boat, but the lights didn't move or flicker. They were perfectly still. After a few minutes, someone else noticed them too. We joked that maybe another group was partying on the opposite shore. Maybe some other seniors doing the same thing we were. It felt harmless. If anything, it added to the mood, like we weren't alone in the night. But the longer they stayed there, the stranger it felt. When you look at headlights from across a lake, they should shift, even just a little, with the water's movement or the distance. These didn't. They were locked in place. I remember checking my watch at 12:17, thinking about how odd it was that they hadn't moved once. We kept drinking, laughing, throwing empty cans toward the dark water, and those lights just sat there like they were watching. Every now and then someone would mention them again, but after a while, it became background. Just another thing in the night. Around 2 in the morning, the air started to cool. The music had stopped and everyone was packing up. I was one of the last to leave. When I looked back across the lake, those same headlights were still there. Same distance, same height above the water, still as ever. It made my stomach tighten for some reason I couldn't explain. I remember staring at them longer than I meant to, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone left their car on. Maybe it was a reflection. But the lake was too calm for that, and the angle didn't make sense. Eventually, I told myself it didn't matter. We were all tired, half drunk, and ready to crash somewhere warm. I drove home just before 3. The next morning, my head was pounding and my mouth tasted like old beer and smoke. My parents were gone, so I made coffee and sat out on the porch staring at nothing. Around 11, my friend Jason called. He said his dad had been out fishing early that morning, just after sunrise on the north side of the lake. He sounded shaken. He said a fisherman found a car submerged near the opposite shore, an old Buick, half sunk in the shallows, with its front end pointed toward the center of the lake. Sheriff's deputies were already there when Jason's dad came by. The keys were still in the ignition. The windows were down. Nobody was inside. At first, I thought he was just trying to freak me out. But later that day, it was on the local news. A brown 80s Buick had been found near an overgrown stretch of the lake's edge, close to where the old access road ended on the north side. The car had been registered to a man who'd gone missing years ago, sometime around 1997. They said the vehicle looked like it had been there for a long time. Moss and silt inside, metal corroded almost to powder. What didn't make sense, the part the news barely mentioned, was that the headlights had supposedly been off when the divers found it, and yet when they pulled the battery, it was warm. Not charged, not even functional, just physically warm to the touch. The sheriff's office said it might have been a reaction from exposure, maybe chemical residue, maybe something to do with the water. But that didn't make any sense to me. Batteries that old don't just heat themselves underwater. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more I played it back, the more wrong it felt. The spot where we saw the lights was directly across from where they pulled the Buick out. Same height above the waterline, same angle. The only thing that didn't fit was time. The man who owned that car had vanished 6 years earlier. His family lived in town. I remember seeing their missing posters taped to store windows when I was a kid. He'd been last seen leaving a bar on Highway 29 after a fight with a coworker. Nobody ever found him or the car, until now. I went back out there 2 days later. It was overcast and cold for late May, the kind of weather that makes the lake look like dull metal. The access road was the same as before, muddy, rutted, lined with trees that leaned in too close. The clearing where we'd parked was still littered with tire tracks and crushed beer cans. You could see the opposite shore faintly through the mist, maybe half a mile away. I tried to pinpoint where we'd seen the lights, but the distance made it hard to tell. Everything looked the same out there. Gray water, gray sky, thin trees. I stood there for a long time, just listening. The place felt heavier now, like something had settled over it. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a held breath. I thought about the headlights, how steady they'd been, how they never wavered even once in hours. I thought about that dead battery, somehow warm after all those years sitting underwater. I knew there had to be an explanation. Maybe we saw something else, maybe the reflection of a boat or distant cabin light. But I couldn't make it fit. Every time I pictured that night, the memory felt too solid, too clear. The headlights were there. I knew what I saw. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the image of that car sitting at the bottom of the lake, its hood buried in silt, headlights facing up toward the surface. I imagined the water creeping in, freezing in winter, thawing in spring. The car slowly rotting, but somehow still holding that last bit of power. Maybe it was just chemical heat or friction, or something nobody cared to explain properly. But the idea that something could linger like that, half dead, half alive, stuck with me. That light we saw wasn't bright or flickering. It wasn't a signal or a warning. It was steady, constant, like it didn't know it was supposed to be gone. Years later, when I drive past Lake Wissota, I still think about that night. The road's been redone now, and the clearing's blocked off by a locked gate. You can't even get down there without hiking. But every time I pass, I glance out over the water. On calm nights, when the lake's still and dark, I sometimes think I see a faint glint on the far shore. Just two small points of light, steady and low, like they're waiting for someone to notice. I always tell myself it's just a porch light or a reflection, but even after all this time, I can still picture those headlights across the water, shining through the dark, too still to be anything alive. I worked nights at a small diner off I-81, one of those 24-hour stops where truckers drift in half asleep and regulars sit in the same booth every night. I usually clocked out around 2 or 3 in the morning, when the air outside still smelled faintly of fry oil and rain on asphalt. The fastest way home was a dirt back road that cut through the hills. Locals called it Creeper Hollow. It wasn't even on GPS anymore, just a thin gray line that ran behind the interstate and wound past some old farmland. Most folks avoided it, said it was too easy to get stuck when it rained, but it saved me 10 minutes. I took it almost every night. That night it had been raining steady since sunset, the kind of cold, soaking rain that turns the air into mist and makes the pavement shine like glass. By the time I got off, the diner lights glowed weak and yellow against the wet dark. The parking lot was empty except for my old Corolla. I sat inside for a minute with the heater on, rubbing my hands together and watching the rain bead and slide down the windshield. I was tired, eyes burning from the fluorescent lights, and all I wanted was my bed. I figured the hollow would be muddy but manageable. I'd driven it in worse. The road started as gravel but turned to packed dirt after a mile, snaking between leafless trees and drainage ditches. My headlights cut through the rain, bouncing off the slick road ahead. The wipers squeaked back and forth, steady and rhythmic, and I had the radio low just to fill the silence. The sound of rain against the roof was heavier now, and every puddle I hit splashed mud up the sides of the car. I remember the way my headlights caught the mist and made it look like smoke rolling across the hood. About halfway through the hollow, the road narrowed into a one-lane stretch where trees leaned in close. Their branches tangled overhead like a tunnel. It always made me uneasy driving through there, even in daylight. You couldn't see far ahead, and if another car came, there was nowhere to pull off. I slowed down a bit, eyes scanning the edge of the road for fallen branches or washouts. That's when I saw her. At first I thought it was a deer, the shape of something pale near the shoulder of the road. But as I got closer, the figure came into view, a woman, standing in the rain, barefoot, wearing a long nightgown that clung to her legs. Her hair was soaked, hanging flat against her face and shoulders. She didn't move when my headlights hit her, just stood there, one arm half raised like she'd been trying to wave someone down. Her skin looked almost gray in the light, and her eyes, at least what I could see of them, were locked on me. I slowed to a crawl, instinctively reaching for the window controls, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was maybe she'd been in a wreck, but there were no cars, no lights, no sign of anything around her. Just the rain and mud and the steady hum of my engine. She didn't take a step forward, didn't flinch when I stopped a few yards away. She just stared. I waited a second, watching for any sign she was okay, but she didn't move. The rain was pouring so hard now I could barely see her face clearly through the windshield. Something about it, her stillness, made every instinct in me tighten. I eased my foot off the brake and rolled forward slowly, giving her space. As my car passed, I could feel her eyes following me, but she didn't turn her body. Just her head, slightly, enough that I could still see the pale blur of her face in the side mirror. Then when I looked again, she was gone. No movement, no sound, just the empty stretch of road behind me lit by my taillights and rain. For a few seconds I thought maybe she'd stepped back into the trees, or that the rain had blurred my vision. My heart was pounding hard enough I could hear it over the rain. I wanted to turn around, but the road was too narrow and slick. I drove the rest of the way home, gripping the wheels so tight my knuckles hurt. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my hands were shaking. I left my car parked crooked and sat inside for a minute before running through the rain to my porch. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying what I'd seen. Her arm lifted, her blank stare, how she vanished in less than a heartbeat. I told myself it had to be the rain, the poor visibility, maybe a trick of the light. But it felt too clear to be a mistake. When I mentioned it at the diner the next night, one of my co-workers looked at me strange. She said, "Creeper Hollow? That road's been washed out since last spring." I told her I drove it all the time, but she shook her head. "Not anymore. The bridge over the gully's gone. You can't even get halfway down before it turns to mud." I didn't argue, but the way she said it made my stomach sink. After my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whole night felt wrong, like I'd dreamed it, but still had the damp, uneasy weight of it in my chest. So the next morning, when the rain had finally stopped, I decided to go back. The sky was gray and heavy, the air still wet and cold, but I needed to see it for myself. I drove the same route, past the turn-off signs and into the hollow. The road looked rougher than I remembered. Deep ruts filled with water, branches scattered across the dirt. The further I went, the worse it got, until the trees started thinning and the ground opened up into a clearing. That's where it ended. The road didn't keep going. It dropped straight into a gully about 20 feet deep. The edges crumbled and washed out. The bridge that used to cross it was completely gone. Just 2 rusted metal posts and chunks of concrete in the mud below. There were no tire tracks, no signs of any car ever coming through. I stepped out and stood there for a while, boots sinking into the wet ground, trying to piece it together. If the road had been gone that long, where the hell had I driven that night? I walked up and down the edge, looking for any sign of the woman. There was nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, not even a mark in the mud. But near the trees on the left side of the road, half buried in wet dirt, I found an old mailbox. It was rusted and dented, the paint long gone except for faint white letters that spelled R. Keen. The door hung open, full of dead leaves. The metal post leaned sideways like it had been forgotten for decades. I just stood there staring at it, feeling this slow, cold weight settle in my stomach. I didn't know anyone by that name. I didn't even know there were still houses out here. But looking past the trees, I saw nothing but thickets and overgrown brush. No path, no clearing, no signs of any home, just emptiness. I got back in the car and sat with the engine idling, watching the steam rise off the hood. The air felt heavier the longer I stayed, like the whole place was holding its breath. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that washed-out road, how the mud looked fresh, like it had just given way recently, not a year ago. And that woman, barefoot in the rain, standing on a road that doesn't even exist anymore. I tried to tell myself I'd taken a wrong turn, that maybe I'd hit some old access trail parallel to the hollow, but I knew that road too well. I'd driven it dozens of times. There were no turns, no splits, no side roads, just the one long stretch that ended in a gully I shouldn't have been able to cross. When I got home, I checked the map again, an old paper atlas I kept in my glove box. The line for Creeper Hollow was still there, faint and dotted, ending right where I'd stood that morning. But there was no indication of any other route leading through. The bridge symbol was crossed out in pencil. Someone had written beside it, "Closed Spring Flood 2023. That night I didn't take the hollow. I stuck to the main road even though it took longer. I still think about it sometimes when I drive past the turnoff. The way the trees seem to swallow the light, the way the road curves out of sight like it's waiting. I never saw the woman again, but every time it rains, I picture her standing there in the downpour, arm raised, waiting for someone who won't stop. And I can't help wondering if maybe, somehow, I drove through a place that wasn't supposed to be there anymore. When I first started teaching at Pine Hollow Elementary, I thought the place had a certain charm to it. The kind of old, quiet building that smelled faintly of chalk and floor polish, with buzzing fluorescent lights, and uneven heating that always left one room freezing and another too warm. It had been built sometime in the 1950s, and the age showed. Cracked tiles in the hallways, paint flaking near the baseboards, pipes that rattled in the ceiling whenever someone flushed a toilet upstairs. But it was sturdy, and everyone said it had character. What no one really talked about much, though, was the basement. It wasn't even called that officially. On the map near the fire exit, it was labeled as maintenance storage, but the teachers all knew it as the basement. It ran underneath the older wing of the school, the section with the library and the first-grade classrooms. There was only one way down, a narrow stairwell beside the janitor's closet, behind a locked gray door that had a faded, authorized personnel only sign taped to it. The principal mentioned it once during orientation, something about asbestos, and how it wasn't safe to be down there because they hadn't fully cleared it out. Old equipment, broken desks, extra chairs, nothing anyone needed to mess with. I didn't think much about it after that. The door stayed locked, and I never had any reason to go near it. My classroom was directly above that old section, room 12. It was a second-grade class, 21 students, small desks, and one old radiator that hissed every morning when it kicked on. During the day, the school was full of noise. Footsteps, laughter, the intercom crackling. But after hours, when everyone left, the place changed. The halls echoed differently. The air felt heavier, the kind of stillness that makes you realize how much sound kids bring to a building. I stayed late a lot during my first year. Grading, lesson plans, bulletin boards, all of it. Most nights I'd leave around 5 or 6. The janitor, Frank, usually started his rounds around that time. Vacuuming, mopping, emptying trash. He was an older guy, quiet, kind of slow-moving, but always polite. He'd just nod when he saw me and keep working. The first time I heard the noise, it was mid-November. I was sitting at my desk around 5:30, everyone long gone. It was dark outside already, the last bit of orange fading from the windows. I had my small desk lamp on and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I remember it because it was so quiet that evening. Then out of nowhere came this dull scraping sound beneath the floor. It was faint at first, but steady, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. I froze, pen in hand, listening. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I thought maybe Frank was moving furniture, but I hadn't seen him go downstairs. A few minutes later, it started again. This time it was slower, more like something being pulled and then set down. It stopped again. The silence afterward felt thicker than before. I waited another minute, stood up, and walked toward the corner of the room where the sound seemed to come from. It was directly above the basement. When I pressed my hand to the floor, I could almost feel a dull vibration, like movement far below. I tried not to let it get to me. Old buildings make sounds, pipes, heat ducts, whatever. I told myself that over and over, but it kept happening. Not every night, just sometimes when I stayed later than usual. Always the same type of sound. Dragging, scraping, then nothing. A few times I even walked out into the hallway to see if Frank was working down there, but I never saw him. Once I even asked casually if he ever went into the basement. He said no, just shook his head and said it was storage junk down there. It was the Friday before winter break when things got worse. Most of the teachers had already left early to travel or finish shopping. I stayed behind to finish grading before the break, figuring I could get a head start. It was just after 6. The building was empty except for me and somewhere Frank. The sky outside had gone dark and the wind had picked up, making the old windows rattle slightly. I had earbuds in, playing low music, when I felt this subtle thud beneath my feet. At first I thought it was my imagination. Then it came again and again. 3 slow knocks, deliberate, spaced apart just enough that they didn't sound like pipes or settling wood. I paused the music. My heart started to pound in my chest. I sat there for maybe half a minute staring at the floor. Then stupidly I stood up and went to the door. I don't know what I expected to do. Maybe convince myself it was nothing. But curiosity gets the better of you in moments like that. The hallway was completely empty. The overhead lights flickered softly, buzzing. I followed the corridor down to the maintenance stairwell. The metal door was closed like always, with that old chain looped through the handle. I almost turned back, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A faint light coming from the crack under the door. It wasn't steady like a bulb. It flickered, shifting shadows faintly across the floor. The basement wasn't supposed to have power. I remembered that from the tour, and yet the light kept moving, like someone was walking with it. I crouched down, trying to peer through the small gap near the frame. All I could make out were patches of dim orange light, and what looked like dust swirling in the air. Then something moved across the gap, just a dark shape, slow and deliberate, followed by that same dragging sound echoing faintly. That was the first time I actually felt afraid. Not uneasy, afraid, because I knew no one was supposed to be down there. I stepped back and went straight to find Frank. He was in the far hallway, mopping near the gym doors. When I told him there was light in the basement, he just stopped moving. He didn't even look at me right away. His hands tightened on the mop handle, and after a few seconds he said quietly, "That room doesn't have power." Then he put the mop aside and started walking with me toward the stairs. When we reached the door, the light was still there, flickering faintly. I could see the shadows shifting against the crack. Frank didn't touch the door. He just leaned close for a second, listening. And then the dragging started again, louder this time. It went on for maybe 20 seconds. Slow, uneven scraping across the floor, like something heavy being pulled through grit and dust. Then silence. Frank didn't say a word. He stepped back, grabbed the chain, and made sure it was tight. Then he locked the upper stairwell door from the outside. I remember his face, completely pale, sweat just beginning to show along his hairline. He didn't meet my eyes. He just said, "You should go home." I didn't argue. I grabbed my bag from the classroom, shut off the lights, and walked out as fast as I could. Over the weekend, I tried to convince myself it had to be something normal. Maybe a maintenance light flickered on accidentally. Maybe animals got in through an old vent, dragging boxes or trash. But the way Frank looked that night, like he'd seen it before, stuck with me. On Monday, the principal sent an email saying some of the lower hallways were closed for asbestos inspection. No one mentioned the basement. No one ever did. I started leaving earlier after that. I didn't stay late alone anymore. Every so often, I'd still hear faint sounds through the floor during class. Little vibrations, dull thuds. The kids never noticed. I pretended not to either. That spring, when transfer requests opened, I put mine in. It wasn't a hard decision. The principal said they were sad to see me go, that I was doing well with the students. But I couldn't stay in that room anymore. Not with the quiet that seemed to hum up from below when the building settled. On my last day, I packed everything, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the doorway of room 12. The floor looked perfectly ordinary, clean tiles, faint scratches from chairs, nothing out of place. But I couldn't stop imagining what was underneath. The basement, sealed off, full of old furniture and storage, maybe still holding whatever caused those noises. As I walked down the hall one final time, I passed the locked maintenance door. The metal was cool when I brushed my hand against it. For a second, I thought I heard it again, the faint scrape of something moving below, but I didn't stop to check. I handed in my keys that afternoon and drove away, and I haven't been back since. Sometimes I wonder if they ever open that basement again, or if it's still sealed off exactly like that, with the lights out and the air stale and still, except for those nights when something down there remembers how to move. I was driving home from Riverton late one evening in early September. The sun was already down and the last bit of orange was fading behind the mountains. The sky was that dull gray blue that comes right before real darkness, and the highway lights hadn't kicked on yet. I had the radio low, just enough to break the silence, and I remember thinking about how empty that stretch of road always felt. I'd driven it dozens of times before, Riverton to Lander, about 30 miles. But that night, a few miles past Hudson, I started seeing construction signs. The first one said road work ahead, then detour in 2 miles. The cones started appearing after that, glowing orange in my headlights, narrowing the lane. I figured it was the usual summer highway maintenance and didn't think twice. The detour sign came up at a small side road I didn't recognize. No street name, just an arrow pointing left with a reflective yellow board that read, Detour. The arrow looked official enough, so I turned. The pavement on that road was smooth, maybe recently resurfaced, which was odd for a back road. No cracks, no gravel, just clean asphalt with faintly painted lines. I drove on, expecting to loop around a few miles before reconnecting with the main highway. But after about 5 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another car. No headlights behind me, no taillights ahead. Just that strange, empty quiet, the kind that settles over rural roads when the air cools down fast after sunset. A small wooden sign appeared on the right. White paint, black letters that read Haven. I slowed down a little. I'd never heard of it before. Didn't even sound familiar. And I'd grown up in Fremont County my whole life. I thought maybe it was one of those tiny unincorporated places, the kind with a church and a few houses, barely on the map. Still, something about it felt off. My GPS had blanked out when I turned off the main highway, just showing a gray screen and the words, No route found. The road curved gently downhill, and soon I saw the town itself. Small houses lined both sides of the main street, all of them nearly identical. White siding, green shutters, front porches with neat wooden railings. Every lawn looked perfectly mowed. There were no cars in the driveways, but the porches had chairs, swings, hanging plants, the little details that made them look lived in. Then I noticed the people. A woman stood on one porch holding a cup of something, just watching me as I passed. She raised her hand slowly and waved. I thought maybe she was just being polite, so I nodded a little and kept going. But then, on the next block, there was another person. A man in a light-colored shirt, standing still by his mailbox, waving too. Not smiling, just waving like he was acknowledging me in silence. As I drove further, I realized it wasn't just one or two people. Almost every house had someone outside. Some stood on their porches, others sat in chairs, all facing the street, all motionless except for the slow movement of their hands as they waved. None of them talked, none of them moved otherwise, and none of them seemed to be doing anything before I arrived. It was like they had all stepped out just to see me pass. I reached a stoplight in the middle of town. It was blinking yellow, the kind you'd expect in a place too small for traffic. Across the intersection was a white church with a tall steeple and a wooden sign that said, Haven Community Church. Its windows were dark, but the lawn looked freshly cut. A single streetlight buzzed above it, throwing a circle of pale light over the front steps. I remember looking at my clock. It was 8:42 p.m. The radio signal had faded to static, so I shut it off. The car idled softly, and for a few seconds I just sat there feeling like I shouldn't be there. The air outside was completely still. No wind in the trees, no insects, not even the hum of distant cars. I glanced around again. On every side street I could see more people, standing near mailboxes, leaning against fences, waving. Always the same slow motion. I tried to tell myself it was some kind of community thing, maybe a local event or a festival. But there were no decorations, no music, no signs of a gathering. Just quiet faces, illuminated in my headlights as I rolled through. At the far end of town, the road opened up again. Another yellow detour sign pointed right, back toward Lander. I followed it without hesitation. Within a few minutes, the road turned to gravel, then back to pavement, and the open fields returned. I looked in my rearview mirror as I left. The last streetlight from Haven flickered once, then disappeared behind me. When I hit the main highway again, my GPS reconnected automatically, showing I was about 15 miles farther along than I should have been. I checked my odometer later, it backed that up. I hadn't gone in circles. The distance was real. I drove the rest of the way home in silence. not thinking much about it until the next morning. A week later at work, I mentioned it casually while eating lunch. I said something about being rerouted through a little town called Haven, somewhere between Hudson and Lander. My coworker, who'd lived around there even longer than me, looked confused. He said there wasn't any town called Haven anywhere near that route. I figured he just didn't know every back road. So that night I checked Google Maps myself. Nothing. I zoomed in all along the area where I thought it should have been. Just open fields and county roads. No named town, no cross streets that matched. I even tried driving that same route the following weekend. There were no detour signs anymore. The highway was open and clear. No cones, no reason to turn off. I looked for the side road anyway, but it wasn't there. Or maybe it was and I missed it. But I drove slower than usual, scanning every turnoff. None had a sign, none looked right. Eventually I gave up and kept driving, but something about it stayed in my mind. Over the next few days I tried to make sense of it. I checked the county records. There had been small settlements that came and went over the decades, mostly mining or farming towns that disappeared once the rail lines moved. But nothing ever called Haven in that area. The name didn't show up in any archive I could find online. For a while, I told myself it was some temporary construction housing. Maybe a set of trailers made to look like homes for a project I didn't know about. But the lawns had been real, the porches built with detail. You don't fake entire houses for a construction crew. And those people, every one of them looked normal, dressed in regular clothes, standing perfectly still like they'd been waiting. It's been months since that night, and I've driven that same stretch of highway half a dozen times since then. It's always the same. No detour, no side road, just a long, empty run between Hudson and Lander. But every time I pass through that area, I glance at the odometer. It's an old habit now. And every single time, right around mile marker 63, the digital readout flickers for a split second. Like it's recalibrating. Never does that anywhere else, sometimes. When the sky starts to dim and the fields get that bluish tint before dark, I think about the quiet streets, the white church, and the people on their porches waving. I don't know who they were or what that place was, but I know I drove through it. The extra miles are still on my car. I can't prove it to anyone, and the maps don't show it. But for 15 miles on a cool September night, Haven existed, at least for me. I bought the radio on a Saturday morning at a flea market off Route 9, the kind of place where old tools and rusted farm signs sit under faded tents, and people sell boxes of things that probably belonged to someone's grandfather. It caught my eye right away, sitting on a wooden table between a pile of cracked records and a typewriter missing half its keys. It was a Zenith Transoceanic, late 1940s maybe. The kind my grandfather used to have in his den. I still remembered sitting next to him as a kid, listening to baseball games on it while he smoked his pipe. The smell of the tobacco, the faint hum of the old speaker, it all came back the moment I saw it. The man selling it said he didn't know if it worked. I didn't really care. I bought it for $15. When I got home, I put it on the dresser in my room. It was heavier than it looked, with that dense, solid feeling old electronics have. The dial glass was fogged, and the metal trim had gone dull from age. When I plugged it in, the light behind the dial flickered weakly, glowing a soft orange. All I got was static, a low hiss with faint crackles when I turned the tuning knob. Every so often, a ghost of a voice or a fragment of music would fade in, then disappear again. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me keep it. Over the next few days, I found myself fiddling with it every night before bed. I'd sit in the dark with only the radio light glowing, turning the knob slowly through the range, trying to catch a station. Sometimes I'd think I heard something, a man talking maybe, or the start of a song, but it always vanished before I could tell for sure. I told myself it was just distant AM signals bouncing off the atmosphere. But a part of me liked the idea that I was catching bits of the past, echoes from some long-dead broadcast. One night, I left the radio on while I dozed off. I'd been lying there listening to the static, that soft ocean sound, and eventually drifted into a half-sleep. The room was dim except for the dull orange glow from the dial. At some point I woke up a little, realizing the sound had changed. The static had gone thinner, higher, like it was trying to form words. I opened my eyes and looked toward the dresser. The light behind the dial was pulsing faintly, like it was breathing. Then, clear as if someone was standing in the room, I heard a voice come through. A man's voice, calm but firm. "Don't go outside." For a few seconds I just stared at the radio. I thought maybe it was a talk show, some late-night transmission cutting through. Then it said my name. Not just once, twice. My full name. Slowly, as if making sure I heard it right. Every hair on my body stood on end. I got up and went to the dresser. The radio kept hissing softly, the voice gone now. That's when I noticed the power cord. It wasn't plugged in. It was hanging loose behind the dresser, the prongs just barely touching the floor. I remember feeling my stomach drop. I picked it up, stared at it for a while, then pulled it completely free from the wall just to be sure. I didn't know what to think. My first thought was maybe the internal battery somehow still held a charge, though it didn't even have one from what I could tell. I unplugged it anyway, carried it to the garage, and left it on the workbench. I closed the door and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe it was one of those moments where you're half awake and your brain fills in sounds. The next morning, I went out to the garage before work. The radio was still there, sitting exactly where I'd left it. I stood there for a while, staring at it like it might move. I thought about throwing it away, but something about it made me hesitate. It was just an old radio. It didn't make sense that I was scared of it. Still, I didn't plug it back in. I left it there. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept glancing at the door to the garage through the window at the end of the hallway. Every small noise made me sit up in bed. The wind, the creak of the house, the hum of the refrigerator. Around midnight I got up to check the locks. The front door was bolted, the back door too. Everything seemed fine. I told myself again that it was nothing, that I was letting an old piece of junk mess with my head. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. 2 days later, I came home from work around 6 in the evening. The sky was starting to go dark, the last bit of light fading behind the trees. As I walked up the driveway, I noticed the side gate to the backyard was open. I never leave it open. The shed door was slightly ajar too, swinging a little in the wind. I felt that same cold feeling in my chest as the night with the radio. I went inside first and grabbed a flashlight. When I opened the shed, everything looked about the same. Tools on the wall, lawnmower in the corner. But the workbench was empty. The radio was gone. I checked the floor, thinking maybe it fell or I'd moved it without remembering. But it wasn't there. Nothing else had been touched. The old bike I kept out there, the garden tools, even the box of spare light bulbs, all untouched. Whoever had come in had taken one thing, that radio. I filed a police report the next morning. The officer who came by asked if anything valuable had been stolen. I told him just an old radio, probably worth $20 at best. He gave me a look like he was trying not to laugh. They took some photos, wrote it up, and told me they'd keep an eye out. But I could tell it wasn't high on their list. I didn't push it. I didn't even tell them about the voice. I didn't want to sound insane. For a while, I kept thinking I'd see it turn up somewhere, maybe at a pawn shop or another flea market. I even checked online listings in the area just to be sure. Nothing. A month passed, then 2. The memory started to fade a little, but I never really forgot it. Every time I heard static from a car radio or walked past an antique shop, it came back to me. The sound of that voice, the way it said my name, the warning. It's been almost a year now. I've replaced the locks on the shed, added a motion light by the gate. I sleep with my phone on the nightstand and the windows locked tight. But sometimes late at night when everything's quiet, I'll swear I hear a faint hum through the walls. Not loud, not enough to be sure, just low enough to make me listen. I'll get up, check every room, look out the windows. There's never anything there. Still, I always take a second before I do, standing by the door, hand on the knob, waiting. Because sometimes when the house is silent enough, I can almost hear it again just for a second. A whisper through the static telling me not to go outside.